Sir Michael, we hear rather worrying things about the kinds of armaments that we're using in this theatre. Anti-personnel weapons, and people are suggesting shells tipped with depleted uranium. Are we doing this kind of thing in Serbia?
Well, I think as the campaign has failed to deliver the political goals that it is being given, we have intensified the bombing campaign and we have widened the target list. And at the end of the day, we still have not moved one step down that road of returning the Kosovo Albanians to their homes.
Ben Bradshaw, could you please cross-examine Sir Michael?
Yes. Why do you think there have been widespread desertions in the last week from the Serb army in Kosovo, and why do you think there have been a spread throughout Serbia of anti-Milosevic riots and demonstrations?
Well, when the NATO press spokesman or President Clinton say that NATO is winning, what it actually means, it is degrading the military capability of the Yugoslav army. And when it bombs at the rate at which it's been bombing, 19,000 sorties against the Yugoslav army, of course you will get a loss of morale and desertions. But that won't necessarily change the strategy of Milosevic. You do not solve complex humanitarian or political problems on the ground from 15,000 feet.
But Sir Michael, forgive me, but what you seem to be advocating is not that the action was wrong, but that it wasn't robust enough in the first place.
There is no single person, I think, in this room or on this planet who would condone the inhuman and brutal practices carried out by the Serb army against the Kosovo Albanians. The objection is the inadequate response by NATO.
But do you not accept the point made by Sir Michael Alexander earlier on this evening, that NATO is an alliance, a voluntary alliance of 19 democratic nations? NATO cannot act without the support of its populations.
If NATO had not had the stomach to go to war properly, then it should not have gone to war in the way it has done, which is so prolonged the suffering, which has so prolonged the suffering of the Kosovo Albanian people.
What you seem to be advocating is acquiescing in genocide in the Balkans. What would you do now? What would you do now?
I think you have misunderstood me 180 degrees. My assertion is very simple, is you do not go to war unless you're determined to achieve your objectives, which was to avert the humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. We went to war knowing that we would never do that.
How can you judge that after 60 days?
Because it's already happened. There are 1.5 million people who say that NATO's strategy has not worked. Of course, if you say
the Kosovo refugees you're talking about, not a single one opposes the NATO action.
Well, if you say to them, are you glad that NATO is doing what it is, of course they would say yes.
Thank you.
If you said to them, would you want NATO to put troops on our ground in the first place to have stopped us being driven from our home, they would have equally have said yes, and I guess they would have meant it a lot more.
General Sir Michael Rose, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. So, defence, your final witness, Michael Ignatieff.
I call Dr. Jamie Shea.
Jamie Shea is NATO's chief spokesman, the non-military face of the organisation of the daily press briefings. He joins us now live from NATO headquarters in Brussels.
Jamie Shea, it's Michael Ignatieff. I wanted to pick up the point made by Sir Michael Rose. His case is there should have been a ground operation from the start. Is there any guarantee whatever that a ground operation, a full ground operation, could have averted the humanitarian catastrophe in Kosovo?
I don't believe, Michael, that it would have worked. First of all, it would have taken several months to get the enormous number of troops, estimated at well over 200,000, to have deployed them in the region, to have trained them, equipped them, and then to have staged a ground invasion of Kosovo. It would have meant a formal declaration of war against Yugoslavia, with the consequences that you can imagine of that, and it would have not have stopped Milosevic's ethnic cleansing. He would have had even longer before being faced with serious resistance from the Western democracies to carry out that ethnic cleansing, which, by the way, he had started well before NATO intervened. In fact, the reason why we started the air campaign is we saw weeks before March the 24th, the date when we started, that ethnic cleansing was well in progress in northern Kosovo.
Okay, there are 3 charges in this indictment against NATO, and I want to take you through them. The first is that you blundered in ill-prepared. How do you plead?
Well, I believe that Western democracies never quite understand just how irrational a dictatorial regime can be. But we weren't badly prepared. We've been trying for the best part of a year to solve the Kosovo crisis through diplomatic channels, through negotiations, even through the threat of force. And we came close to it at Rambouillet when the Kosovo Albanian side signed. It was because Milosevic backed away from that and began his ethnic cleansing that we intervened. But we could not have stopped something which has not simply been a humanitarian disaster since NATO acted, but which has been a humanitarian disaster for 10 years now, since Milosevic removed autonomy from Kosovo in 1989. Let's not forget that 250,000 people were driven from their homes by Milosevic's forces in the year before NATO resolved to take action.
The second charge is that you lack a viable strategy for achieving your aims. How do you plead to that one?
Again, I think that's wrong. I think that anybody who feels that this could only be solved through the total destruction of Yugoslavia in an all-out war is really not recognizing the fact that we, the democracies, can do things in a more intelligent way. First of all, we are now having a serious impact on the Yugoslav forces, which is, after all, the asset which Milosevic values most. And that toll is mounting. For example, in the last few weeks, we have managed to destroy over 700 pieces of heavy military equipment in Kosovo. Secondly, we have succeeded in isolating Milosevic diplomatically. We are working with Russia now and the United Nations towards a common diplomatic front around a robust Security Council resolution. Thirdly, we have prevented Milosevic spreading the conflict onto the territory of neighbouring countries. He has tried to use refugees as a weapon to destabilise those countries, but we have not allowed him to do so. Those countries now firmly back us, and they too are imposing economic sanctions on Milosevic. We have isolated Milosevic economically through the oil embargo, which over 30 countries are
Jamie,
now
I must interrupt you
implementing,
there.
far more than just NATO.
Jamie
and
Shea.
finally, I believe, if I may just end, finally, I believe we have been successful not only in putting pressure on the victimizers, but also in helping the victims of the ethnic cleansing through the unprecedented mobilisation of NATO soldiers to help with the refugees.
Michael Ignatieff.
Half of this audience seems to believe there should have been a ground operation from the start. Can you confirm that preparations are now well underway for the deployment of upwards of 50,000 troops in the theater?
Yes, we're making those preparations, but again, the ground option is not a panacea. It would have led to far more deaths, I can assure you, including civilian deaths, than what we've seen from the air campaign. And I again say it would have taken so long to prepare that it would not have stopped the ethnic cleansing. It would have also meant all-out war with Yugoslavia. But we are now preparing for a peace implementation force which can be deployed in Kosovo for the refugees to go home as soon as the air campaign has succeeded in forcing the Serb forces to leave.
Jamie Shea, stay with us now, because I'd like, please, Bob Marshall-Andrews for the prosecution to cross-examine.
Dr. Shea, you work for NATO, do you not? You work for NATO.
Do indeed.
You are its spokesman. Yes? You are accountable to NATO. Yes? We have heard many, many times from Michael Ignatieff and others that one of the problems that NATO has, and one of the reasons why this war is being conducted in the way that it is that you are answerable to 19 democratic states. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and I think that that is a source of strength.
Yes, 19 democratic states, and no doubt you would say this is a war for democracy. Yes?
I think it's a war for human rights.
Yes, would you mind explaining why the House of Commons in this country, with its members that represent people sitting in this hall, have been denied on 4 separate occasions the right to vote on this war?
That is a question not for NATO. That is a question for constitutional procedures in the United Kingdom, and I have no say over that. Let me however, state that in many NATO countries where constitutional arrangements are different, such as in Germany, the German Bundestag and other parliaments have overwhelmingly voted in favour of this action, continue to do so.
Can you answer my question?
Can you answer my question? And for their troops to participate.
Why in Britain have me, been denied the right to vote on this war? Can you answer that question?
This is not for me to say. I'm a NATO representative.
Exactly.
I'm not a member of the
That is the answer that I wanted. You are responsible to nobody except NATO, which is not responsible to anybody. Now let me deal with the bombing, Dr. Shea. Let me remind you of something that you said on the 12th of April of this year. You said this: NATO would target military targets only, and then you said, television and radio towers are only struck if they are integrated into military facilities. You then said there is no policy to strike television and radio transmitters as such. 12 days later, quite deliberately and without warning, NATO bombed the main television station in Belgrade, killing a number of wholly innocent civilians. What you said on the 12th of April was a lie, was it not? Out and out.
No, the Yugoslav media is not the BBC, nor is it ITN. The Yugoslav media is an arm of the government which has been used since 1991 to inflame nationalist passions across the country.
John, I can't have
First of all. Secondly, is that those media also integrate military radio relay transmitters which are used for military communications, thereby making them a legitimate military target.
Two weeks later, you struck the Chinese embassy.
I must intervene and ask you to allow Jamie Shea to answer the questions properly, please.
Well, that's no problem with that.
You pose your question, please.
Yes. 2 weeks after that, after striking this radio station, which you said was not policy, NATO struck the Chinese embassy. The reason that they did so was because they were using a 7-year-old map. Is there any other description? Is there any other description of that than a massive blunder?
Yes, but you seem to be implying that because sometimes democracies make mistakes in conducting a just war, that they should stop and therefore tolerate the oppression of 1.6 million people being forced from their homes. I'd rather be on the side of democracies making a mistake, procure justice and human rights for European people in the centre of Europe, than to say that because there is a mistake, we should give up and simply tolerate those injustices to be committed.
Jamie Shea,
one or two mistakes does not invalidate the cause
Jamie Shea, NATO headquarters, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. Well, now we've heard the case for and against the NATO action in Kosovo, but before each side closes their case, let's hear some views from the audience. Immediately, a forest of hands up here. Yes, in the fourth. Yes, indeed.
My question goes to John Nichols and Sir Michael Rose. Has a war ever been achieved from bombing from the air? I mean, from their own military experience? And secondly, where does all this end, for goodness sake? That's my question.
Right. Comments too from the yellow tie at the back there, yes?
I think we've heard a lot about commitments to the humanitarian crisis, but I wonder how much commitment it takes to bomb from 15,000 feet and to send cruise missiles in from the Mediterranean. I wouldn't say that's commitment. I'd say that's morally wrong, and it's not commitment, it's cowardice.
Could we, yes, in the third row back here, yes? Yes?
As we get near the end of this century, we've got to all recognise that we are a global community with global responsibilities, global obligations, and above all, global moral duties. And yes, I do feel that we needed to intervene in this, and I'm not putting, you know, the people that are doing the intervening away from us. We're all part of this. But more than anything, and I've got Kosovan friends, and I've got friends from all different places, we need to get in there on the ground and get between the aggressors. We should have done it long ago. We should have not let Milosevic sit where he's sitting and go on with what he's doing with the history that he's got. We need to get in there and we need to help these people.
Thank you. In the purple shirt. In the purple shirt.
Yeah, lots of the pro-war speakers have talked about 19 democratic countries being members of NATO. What about Turkey, which systematically, ethnically claims as the Kurds?
In the pale blue shirt behind me here, yes?
Regarding the bombing of the Serb television station, isn't that the same as the Serbians closing down the B92 radio station?
Could I, yes, in the yellow tie here.
This action by NATO is criminal. Yeah. The Natural Law Party has offered a solution to this problem without the use of violence. A group of yogic flyers has been scientifically shown to be effective.
There, sir.
I wouldn't go as far as opposing the war, but I feel that it is ill-prepared and half-hearted. As Sir Michael Rose says, the price for casualties from NATO side is valued a lot more than the other side.
Yes, at the end of the row there, yes.
I think that the point about it all now is we shouldn't be discussing what's just happened. What are we going to do now? Are we going to abandon the whole situation by withdrawing NATO now? We've got to make up our minds what to do now.
We've got to get in there.
And in the blue sweater up there, yes.
I'm personally quite glad that a policy of airstrikes seems to be relieving me of the responsibility of having to go to Kosovo with a gun, or people like me anyway, which I'm personally very thankful for. I just wonder whether if there doesn't seem to be a coherent way of doing it by force, what Marie Ube and the UNHCR could do with $10 billion.
Finally, with the white jacket, yes?
Reference to what your man's just said, I've actually fought in the war against Milosevic and the war against Tudjman. I was in the Bosnian army for 2.5 years. What I must say is NATO's strategy is not coherent, it's not good, it's not working. However, we must make the stand. We must make it strong.
Let's leave it on that note. Thank you very much indeed. Well, our audience will soon give their verdict, but before they do, let's hear the closing statements from either side. Firstly, Bob Marshall-Andrews for the prosecution.
I am British and I care deeply what my country does. This indictment is not an indictment of Britain or British forces. It is neither treasonable nor pro-Milosevic or the gross violations which he has perpetrated. NATO has blundered into this conflict for which it was never designed and never intended. It has arrogated to itself the role of a global policeman without thought of the implications or consequences. It has denied to your elected members of Parliament even a vote. The catalogue of ghastly errors is a sad metaphor for the wider blunder of which they are a part. A new world order of peace is something in which I have believed passionately all my life. This action, illegal, arbitrary, lacking coherence and political and strategic government. It was ill-prepared on the basis of a crude ultimatum. It will set back that new world order for generations.
Thank you, Bob Marshall-Andrews. Ben Bradshaw, your closing statement, please, for the defence.
Let me first deal with the travesty that Bob Marshall-Andrews suggested there had been no vote in Parliament. He and a few colleagues forced a vote on a technical amendment the last time this was debated. They got 11 votes. The prosecution doesn't seem to be able to make up its mind whether there has been not enough action or too much action. We believe Milosevic left the international community no alternative. To have done nothing would have been to acquiesce in racism and genocide in Europe at the turn of the millennium. And it would have been a green light to tyrants all over the world that they could create gross human rights violations in their countries and the world would stand idly by. It's far too soon to judge whether this has been a success or a failure. The Kosovan refugees, not a single one of whom criticizes the action, they have not lost faith with NATO, so we should not lose faith either. Vote not guilty.
Thank you very much, Ben Bradshaw. Now, our audience of 250 drawn from across the country, it's time for you to reach your verdict. Each of you has an electronic console with a yes button and a no button. Please don't touch either until I tell you to vote. Tonight, NATO is charged with blundering ill-prepared into the Kosovo crisis without a viable strategy to achieve its aims, thereby worsening a humanitarian disaster. If you're convinced that this is the case, you vote yes. If you regard the verdict as not proven beyond reasonable doubt, you have to acquit NATO of the charges and vote no. So, what is your verdict on NATO? Please vote now. Well, now, there are the figures, and it appears to be 60 days into the conflict that people have delivered their verdict. The result is 61% have voted that NATO is guilty, 39% not guilty. So therefore, NATO, according to the votes cast here tonight, is guilty of the charge of having blundered into the Kosovo crisis, ill-prepared, without clear aims, and precipitating a worse humanitarian crisis. So, having heard the arguments detailed for and against the conflict spelt out tonight, our representative audience turned against NATO and judged its campaign in Kosovo as being blundering and ill-conceived. To our advocates for the defence and for the prosecution, and to our witnesses and you, the audience. Thank you and good night.
If President Milosevic will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
Any attack on Yugoslavian state sovereignty would be unacceptable, but an attack in Serbia's Jerusalem is the most unacceptable of all.
This is not a battle for NATO. This is not a battle for territory. This is a battle for humanity.